At her daughter's wedding, the mother fainted during a toast. The paramedics tried to save her but failed. A few minutes later, the waiter rushed to help, and everyone was shocked to see what he did. The sun was gently setting on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and gold. On the farm where Emily's wedding was taking place, everything seemed straight out of a fairy tale. White flowers adorned every corner, spreading a soft fragrance in the air, while twinkling lights hung from the trees, dancing in the light breeze of late afternoon. Laughter echoed among the guests, all sharing the same sense of joy and enchantment. For Emily, this was the day she had always dreamed of, the beginning of a new chapter in her life. Margaret, her mother, stood beside her daughter, smiling as she watched the happiness radiating from Emily's face. Dressed in an elegant blue suit that highlighted her light eyes, she looked like the perfect picture of a proud mother. However, amid the beauty of the moment, there was something almost imperceptible in her expression. Amidst the smiles and embraces, a silent melancholy lingered in her eyes. A slight shadow of concern hid behind her serene demeanor, but no one seemed to notice. After all, it was her daughter's big day, and that should be enough reason for any unease to disappear. Emily, for her part, was radiant. The white dress she had chosen with such care seemed to float as she walked through the hall, greeting friends and family. Her eyes sparkled with happiness, and her laughter was sincere, overflowing with hope. Yet, even in the midst of the euphoria of the moment, she noticed her mother's slight withdrawal. "Is everything all right, Mom?" Emily whispered, gently adjusting her veil. Margaret gave a soft smile, shaking her head as if to dispel any worry. "Everything is perfect, my dear. You look stunning." The guests were equally enchanted. The celebration was the perfect blend of elegance and simplicity, something that reflected Emily's personality. Everyone commented on how she and the groom seemed destined for each other and how Margaret had raised such an extraordinary daughter. But, no matter how joyful the atmosphere, there was a subtle, almost invisible tension in the air. It was as if something was lurking, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself, but no one could predict what was to come. As night fell and the lights around the farm shone more intensely, the hall became even more magical. Violins played a soft melody, and couples began to make their way to the dance floor. Emily, standing beside her groom, looked at every detail with emotional eyes, as if she were engraving every second into her memory. She wanted to remember that day forever, every smile, every word of affection, every gesture of love. Everything seemed to be in perfect harmony. While the party continued, Margaret watched her daughter from a distance, her gaze a mixture of pride and nostalgia. For her, it wasn't just Emily's wedding, but also a reminder of the time that had passed. The sparkle in her daughter's eyes was a reflection of the young woman Margaret once was, full of dreams and promises for the future. Life, however, had taught her that not all dreams come true as planned, and the weight of past choices now seemed more present than ever. Even surrounded by loved ones, Margaret felt a slight tightness in her chest. She knew it was Emily's moment, but something inside her wouldn't let her rest. Her trembling fingers nervously fidgeted with the ring she had always worn, a gesture that, had Emily noticed, she would have recognized as a sign of anxiety. But the young bride was too busy with her guests, unaware of her mother's distress. The sense that something was out of place began to intensify, but no matter how hard Margaret tried, she couldn't pinpoint what was bothering her so much. Perhaps it was just nerves about seeing her daughter take such an important step, or maybe it was the weight of memories from the past, those she had worked so hard to bury. When the moment of the toast arrived, the hall fell into complete silence. All eyes were on Margaret as she slowly rose from her chair. With a glass of champagne in her trembling hands, she took a deep breath before she began to speak. The smile she wore seemed to shine less brightly than before, but even so, she emanated a strong and maternal presence. "Today is the happiest day of my life," she began, her voice soft, almost whispered, filled with emotion. "Emily, since the day you were born, I always knew you would be an incredible woman." Emily, standing beside her groom, listened intently, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to well up in her eyes. Margaret continued, recalling moments from her daughter's childhood, stories that brought soft laughter from the guests. There was something deeply personal in the way she described Emily's growth, as if each word had been carefully chosen to express the immense love she felt. However, as her speech went on, her voice began to tremble slightly. The tremor in her voice was almost imperceptible at first but soon became evident. Margaret tried to disguise it, lifting the glass to her lips as if the champagne could ease the growing discomfort inside her. "I always wanted the best for you," she said, but then hesitated, a pause that lasted too long. The hall was filled with an uncomfortable silence. She lowered the glass, looked at Emily and opened her mouth to continue, but her words seemed trapped somewhere deep inside. Margaret's hands began to tremble visibly now, and her face, once illuminated by the emotion of the moment, turned pale. The guests who had initially smiled during the speech, began to exchange worried looks. Emily took a step towards her mother, her eyes filled with apprehension. "Mom?" she asked in a low tone, almost inaudible as she felt a tightness in her chest. Something was terribly wrong. It was then that Margaret dropped the glass of champagne. The sound of glass shattering on the floor echoed through the hall like a gunshot. Margaret's body swayed for a second before collapsing heavily to the floor, motionless. A scream of horror echoed throughout the room. A nearby guest put her hand over her mouth, unable to believe what she was seeing. The world, which had been in perfect harmony just moments before, suddenly seemed to stop. Time froze and Emily's heart raced. Emily rushed toward her mother, but it was as if her legs refused to obey the urgency she felt. Each step seemed dragged, as if the ground were moving in slow motion beneath her. The cheerful conversations from before were quickly replaced by nervous whispers and murmurs of panic. The guests stood up, some trying to approach, others paralyzed by shock. The soft music, which had previously lulled the moment, ceased. Someone call for help," shouted the groom, his desperate voice cutting through the heavy air of tension. He ran to Emily's side, trying to do anything, but he felt powerless. Margaret lay still, and her breathing, if it still existed, was almost imperceptible. The twinkling lights that had once added a magical touch to the night now seemed oppressively bright, highlighting the unfolding tragedy. The seconds seemed like hours. The twinkling lights, the alarmed whispers, and the gazes fixed on Margaret's body created a suffocating atmosphere. No one knew exactly what to do. Emily's dream wedding had turned into a nightmare in a matter of seconds. As chaos began to set in, Emily knelt beside her mother, her heart crushed by uncertainty. "Mom, please stay with me." Chaos overtook the banquet hall. The sound of the shattered glass still resonated, but now it mixed with cries of horror and murmurs of confusion. Emily, in shock, tried to push through the crowd that was beginning to gather around her mother. Her heart beat so fast that it felt as though time itself had distorted, the sounds around her becoming distant and muffled. She stumbled over her own feet as she ran in desperation, the word "Mom" escaping her lips in a whisper barely audible amidst the commotion. The guests, who had been radiant and smiling moments before, now moved nervously, unsure of what to do. Some tried to get closer, offering help, while others just stood by, frozen with uncertainty. Panic spread like an uncontrolled flame, consuming the joy of the celebration. Emily's gaze was fixed on her mother's lifeless body, while tears already began to well up in her eyes. Her mind refused to accept the gravity of what was happening, but her body, driven by instinct, tried to reach her at all costs. In the midst of the chaotic scene, two uniformed figures emerged from the crowd, doctors who had been among the guests. Without wasting any time, they knelt beside Margaret, checking her vital signs. One of them, visibly tense, began performing resuscitation maneuvers, while the other organized the people around them, asking for space and silence. Emily, desperate, fell to her knees beside her mother, immediately being pulled back by the doctor. "Will she be okay?" Emily asked, her voice trembling, the words almost without strength. The doctor didn't answer. His eyes were focused on the task at hand, and that alone was a bad omen. The hall, once filled with laughter and music, was now filled only with the mechanical sounds of resuscitation efforts and the hushed murmurs of those present. The air was heavy, suffocating, as if the impending tragedy absorbed all the lightness of the environment. Emily, kneeling at a safe distance, could hardly breathe. The people around watched with wide eyes, some with their hands covering their mouths, others staring blankly, unable to look away. It was as if they were all trapped in a collective nightmare. Outside, the distant sound of sirens began to echo, bringing with it a strange mix of hope and despair. The sharp sound cut through the quiet night, approaching slowly, but it didn't seem fast enough. Emily watched, helpless, as her mother remained motionless, the medics working frantically to bring her back. Emily's groom, who had been trying to calm the guests and maintain order, finally reached her. He held her by the shoulders, trying to offer some comfort, but Emily barely registered his presence. Her eyes were fixed on Margaret, her body trembling with restrained emotion. "Emily, everything will be all right," he murmured, but his own voice faltered as he said the words, as if he didn't believe what he was saying. The tension among the guests was palpable. Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, the paramedics arrived. Carrying equipment and wearing serious expressions, they quickly took over from the guest doctors. There was an urgency in the air, but also a troubling sense that time was running out. As the paramedics moved with precision, Emily felt the ground fall away beneath her feet. It was as if the entire day, which should have been the happiest of her life, was slipping through her fingers like sand. The sounds of the equipment, the medical commands, and the hurried footsteps filled the air, but Emily's heart pounded so loudly in her ears that it was all she could hear. She held her groom's trembling hands, but her eyes were glued to the scene, to the fight for her mother's life. The scene of flowers and lights around them seemed like a cruel contrast to the gravity of the moment. In a single second, what had been a dream had turned into a nightmare from which she could not wake up. The sound of the equipment suddenly stopped, and with it, any remaining hope that had lingered in the air was silently destroyed. The paramedics who had previously worked urgently, now exchanged heavy, desolate glances. One of them, with a firm hand on his colleague's shoulder, shook his head almost imperceptibly, but it was enough to make the verdict clear. Time seemed to have stopped entirely, and the silence that followed was deafening. Emily, who had been watching everything with her heart racing, felt her legs give way. The ground suddenly seemed so far away and she collapsed, powerless, into her groom's arms, who held her tightly but couldn't stop his own tears from falling. Emily's tears, however, were different. They didn't flow from immediate sadness but from a cruel impotence, a pain she could not fully comprehend yet. She cried for something that felt so surreal that her mind refused to accept it. The guests who had been in shock moments earlier, now bowed their heads in a collective, silent mourning. It was as if the news had hit everyone all at once, sweeping away any trace of festivity or joy that had previously dominated the atmosphere. Muted whispers could be heard here and there, but they were mere echoes of a situation that no one knew how to process. The energy of the night, once vibrant and full of life, was now consumed by a void that engulfed everything around it. The twinkling lights seemed cruelly out of place in that moment. Emily's wedding dress, white and pure, was now stained with the sadness of that moment. She could barely breathe between sobs as she clung to her groom, feeling the weight of a brutal reality on her shoulders. Her mother, the woman who had always been by her side, the constant figure of love and support, was now irreversibly distant. What should have been the happiest day of her life had turned into an abyss of pain and loss. Emily wanted to scream, but no sound came from her mouth. As tears streamed down Emily's face, the hall remained frozen. The sound of life seemed to have completely drained away. The mournful whispers of the guests were not enough to break the overwhelming silence. Emily's gaze was fixed on her mother's body, now lying motionless, surrounded by desolate paramedics. It was hard to believe that just minutes before, Margaret had been alive, laughing, making plans for the future. Now she was gone and the emptiness she left behind was crushing. Among the faces around, people slowly began to retreat, respecting Emily's private moment of grief. Some discreetly wiped away tears, while others simply looked down, as if avoiding eye contact could somehow lessen the weight of the tragedy. The silence was absolute. There was no more music, no more laughter, only raw pain and the sound of tears falling one by one onto the floor. Emily's groom, trying to be the pillar of strength that he knew she needed, gently caressed her hair with a desperation in his touch. He whispered words of comfort, but they seemed to disappear into the air, unable to reach her shattered heart. He knew that nothing he said could fill the void that had been created, but even so, his presence was all he could offer at that moment. Emily didn't respond. Her body trembled slightly in his arms, exhausted by the pain that consumed her. The festive atmosphere, once filled with promises, had now transformed into a deep, painful mourning. And while the guests began to accept the inevitability of loss, Emily remained there, paralyzed in her grief. Margaret, her mother, her anchor, would never return. And this truth, as silent as it was, now echoed in every corner of the hall, while the sound of the sirens faded into the distance. Among the many grief-stricken faces, there was one that remained strangely calm. The waiter, Richard, watched everything from a distance, his eyes fixed on Margaret's body. His posture, however, didn't reflect the despair of the others. He was still, almost serene, as if he were waiting for something. The plates he had been holding earlier were left aside without ceremony, and his attention, now entirely focused on the scene, seemed to suggest a knowledge that the others did not possess. Around him, the other staff members whispered quietly, their gazes shifting between Richard and the unfolding tragedy. "Did you see him?" one waitress whispered, her eyes wide. "He seemed strange, as if he already knew what was going to happen." No one answered, but the discomfort was palpable. Richard's presence, until then insignificant among the anonymous faces of the service staff, now drew confused stares. Something about him didn't fit with the scene of despair. Without saying a word, Richard began walking toward Margaret. His steps were firm but not rushed. Each movement seemed calculated, as if he knew exactly what to do. As he approached, a few nearby guests noticed the change in his posture and frowned, intrigued. "What's he doing?" one man whispered to his wife, who just shook her head, unable to respond. Emily, lost in her own pain, didn't notice the waiter's approach. Her groom, however, lifted his eyes briefly and saw Richard moving toward his mother-in-law's body. He furrowed his brow, confused but lacked the strength to question it. The tension in the air was too dense, the moment saturated with a strangeness that no one could define. The hall, which moments ago had been a scene of chaos and despair, now seemed suspended in a disquieting stillness. Some of the more observant guests began to take notice of Richard's presence, and their discreet murmurs cut through the tense silence of the room. "Why is he going over there?" a voice asked. "He's just a waiter," another said, incredulous but unable to take their eyes off him. There was something in the way he walked that prevented any interruption, as if an invisible force kept them still, just watching. When Richard finally reached Margaret, he paused beside her body for a moment, his gaze firm and contemplative. The soft light from the lamps around them seemed to illuminate his face in an almost supernatural way. What could he possibly do there? The question hung in everyone's mind, but no one dared to voice it. The breathing of those present was held, as if they were about to witness something that defied logic, something they had already begun to sense. He knelt beside Margaret, his movements smooth and respectful, but filled with an unknown intention. The hall, which had burst into whispers and murmurs moments before, now fell into an absolute silence, every pair of eyes fixed on what he would do next. The atmosphere was thick with expectation, almost as if time had slowed down again, waiting for the unfolding of a mystery that no one had predicted. Richard knelt beside Margaret's lifeless body with a precision that seemed almost ritualistic. He extended his hand and, with a surprising delicacy for someone who had been invisible at the party until now, held Margaret's cold hand. The stiffness of death had already begun to take hold of her body, but this didn't seem to disturb Richard. His expression was serious but not desperate. There was a deep calm in his eyes, as if he knew something no one else did. Everyone in the hall, who had been gripped by panic and grief just moments before, now watched in a heavy silence, unable to understand what was happening before them. Emily, still engulfed in her sorrow, barely registered what was happening. She was so consumed by the shock of her loss that the movements around her seemed distant, blurred. Her groom, however, noticed what the waiter was doing. He looked around at the other guests, expecting someone to intervene, to say something. But the silence remained absolute. No one dared interrupt. All eyes were on Richard, waiting without understanding why. Richard, kneeling, closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if concentrating his strength on something greater, something unseen by those around him. When he opened his eyes again, there was no doubt on his face. He slowly leaned over Margaret, bringing his face close to hers, and began murmuring something softly, words that no one could make out. His lips moved carefully, as if each word carried immense weight, an ancient and forgotten truth. The paramedics, who had stepped back after their failed attempt to save Margaret, now watched, intrigued and perhaps a little suspicious. What did this waiter think he could do? It was an absurd scene. An anonymous staff member, who until now had been serving tables, kneeling beside a woman declared dead, whispering into her ear. Yet, despite the strangeness, something about the moment kept everyone present completely still. No one dared to interrupt, as if, somehow, they sensed that something extraordinary was about to happen. The hall, once full of bright lights and festive music, now felt like the stage of a profound mystery. The silence was so absolute that the faint rustling of the leaves outside could be heard, carried by the night wind. The candles flickered on the tables, and the soft glow they emitted created dancing shadows on the walls. The setting, which had once seemed like nothing more than a wedding celebration, was now the backdrop for something far more complex, something no one could have anticipated. As Richard continued murmuring, the guests exchanged confused glances. "What's he saying?" whispered a woman, clutching her husband's hand. He just shook his head, as lost as she was. There was something deeply unsettling, yet hypnotic, in the way Richard behaved. The words he uttered, though inaudible, seemed to carry an ancient weight, as if they were invoking something beyond comprehension. Time seemed to stretch. Each passing second felt like an eternity. Richard, still holding Margaret's hand, kept his eyes on her without faltering. His voice, though soft, seemed to fill the space in a way that defied logic. And then, for a moment that seemed suspended in the air, everything went completely still. Even the rustling of the leaves outside stopped. Everyone held their breath as if they were standing on the edge of an abyss, waiting for something impossible. The impossible happened suddenly. As everyone watched Richard murmur something inaudible beside Margaret's body, a deep gasp echoed in the silent hall. Margaret, who had been motionless and cold, gently moved her chest as if she were catching her breath. The sound was almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make everyone around hold their breath. The eyes of the guests widened, shock written on every face. No one could believe what they were seeing. Emily, still kneeling near her mother, felt her heart stop for a moment, unable to process what her eyes were seeing. She blinked repeatedly as if it were a cruel illusion. "Mom?" she murmured, her voice trembling, but her mind was too stunned to comprehend. Her groom held her more tightly, unable to look away from the surreal scene unfolding before them. Margaret, who had been declared dead moments ago, now seemed to be coming back? The people around exchanged looks of disbelief, the tension in the air almost tangible. What was happening? How was this possible? Some began murmuring among themselves, trying to find rational explanations, while others remained paralyzed, unable to form a single word. The figure of Richard, kneeling beside Margaret, made everything even stranger. Who was he? And what had he done? These questions circled through the confused stares, but no one dared interrupt the moment. Margaret opened her eyes slowly, as if waking from a deep, disturbing dream. Her gaze was vague, almost as if she were between two worlds, still not fully understanding where she was. She blinked, adjusting to the soft light of the hall and the expressions of horror and amazement that surrounded her. Richard, beside her, still held her hand firmly, his face impassive as if all of this were expected. The murmurs in the hall began to grow, a wave of disbelief that seemed to gain strength with every passing second. "This can't be happening," one of the guests whispered, clutching her husband's hand. Other guests, who had stepped back in fear, now took small steps forward, as if drawn by the gravity of the impossible moment. The atmosphere, once filled with tears and mourning, was now charged with a tension full of unanswered questions. Emily, her heart racing, looked from Richard to her mother, trying to find some logic in all of it. She felt a mixture of relief, fear, and confusion, a whirlwind of emotions that left her even more vulnerable. Margaret slowly turned her head to look at her daughter, her eyes finally focusing on Emily, as if she were trying to recall something lost in the depths of her mind. "Emily." Margaret's voice was weak, but it was real. It was alive. As the room remained engulfed in silence, Richard stood up calmly, his eyes still fixed on Margaret. He didn't seem surprised, there was no trace of shock on his face. The eyes of everyone, which moments before had been fixed on Margaret, now slowly turned to Richard. That waiter, who had been an almost invisible figure until then, was now at the center of something no one could understand. Emily, still kneeling beside her mother, felt the air around her shift. The murmur of the guests grew louder as disbelief spread, but the silence between her and Richard was deafening. She looked at him, waiting, demanding an explanation for what had just happened. Richard, sensing the weight of the gazes upon him, stood up slowly. His face, once marked by an odd serenity, now carried a more serious air. He looked directly at Emily, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. What would he say? He took a deep breath before speaking, his voice firm and full of something Emily couldn't decipher. "I knew your mother, a long time ago," he said calmly, his words echoing in the silence of the hall. Emily's confusion only grew. He knew her mother? Oh, why had Margaret never mentioned this man before? The questions swirled in her mind like a whirlwind, but none of them found a clear answer. She looked at her mother, who still seemed fragile, trying to piece together a puzzle that made no sense. "But how? Who are you?" Emily finally asked, her voice trembling but filled with urgency. Her heart raced, and each of Richard's words unsettled her more. Richard paused, as if carefully weighing his next words. The entire room was suspended, waiting. "Margaret and we were close. Very close actually," he continued, looking directly into Emily's eyes. His eyes shone with a mixture of nostalgia and sadness. Whatever he was about to reveal clearly carried immense weight. Emily, however, could barely believe what she was hearing. How could her mother have hidden something like this for so long? The silence of the guests now seemed suffocating. Everyone there was waiting for an explanation, but for Emily, that moment felt more and more surreal. How had someone so important in her mother's life remained invisible for so long? And why now, on her wedding day, was this secret coming to light? She looked from Richard to her mother, searching for some sign of confirmation. Margaret, still weak, just closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to gather strength to face what was coming next. The whispers among the guests began to grow again, but Richard ignored them. His eyes were fixed on Emily as if he were speaking only to her. "We were close friends, in college. We dreamed together, made plans for the future," he said with a slight smile that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. The atmosphere in the hall began to change. The guests' faces, once filled with astonishment, were now mixed with curiosity. Many of them were trying to absorb this unexpected revelation, trying to understand what it meant. But for Emily, each of Richard's words was a new open wound. Her mind desperately tried to comprehend how her mother had kept something so big a secret. And more than that, why now, at that moment, was the past intertwining with the present in such a dramatic way? Richard took a deep breath, as if the memories he was about to share were pulling him into a distant past, a place he had avoided for so long. "Your mother and I met in college," he began, his voice filled with nostalgia. "She was brilliant, full of ideas and dreams. We quickly became inseparable friends." As he spoke, the hall around them seemed to disappear, and the image of a young Margaret, full of life, began to form in everyone's minds. A woman that Emily could hardly imagine, so different from the reserved and silent figure she knew. At that time, Margaret was ambitious and determined, dreaming of changing the world. Richard remembered how they spent hours discussing books, ideas, life philosophies. "She always had a quick response, always challenged what I said," he said with a sad smile. "Our conversations lasted late into the night, and the more time we spent together, the more our friendship became something special." There was a sweetness in his words, an admiration that seemed to transcend the years. But it wasn't just friendship that united them. Richard spoke of a deep connection, a bond that went beyond words. They were partners in adventures and dreams, building a friendship that seemed unbreakable. "There was an understanding between us, something I've never found in anyone else," Richard continued, his eyes distant, as if he could see that time again. Emily listened in silence, trying to assimilate the idea of a Margaret so different from the one she had always known. However, as in so many stories, something interrupted this happiness. Richard hesitated before continuing, as if the memory of what was to come was too painful. "There was an incident," he said, his voice lower now. "Something that changed everything between us." He didn't immediately explain what had happened, but the expression on his face and the weight in his words indicated that that moment had been a turning point. "We drifted apart, and never spoke again. What we had was destroyed, and each of us went our own way." His words echoed in the hall, full of regret and sorrow. Emily felt the weight of what was to come, but for now she could only focus on trying to imagine her mother living this other life. The silence between them, this empty space that had formed after the incident, was now a shadow hanging over the entire story. Richard clearly still carried the scars of that past, but for Emily, all of this was new, a reality she had never even imagined. She looked at Margaret, trying to find answers in her mother's face, but Margaret seemed fragile, lost in her own memories. Emily wondered how her mother had carried that weight for so long, without ever mentioning Richard, without ever revealing this chapter of her life. What kind of pain could have been so great that it had to be buried so deeply? And why now, on her wedding day, was it all surfacing? "I always thought that somehow our lives would cross paths again," Richard admitted, his eyes now fixed on Margaret. "But I never imagined it would be like this." The room was enveloped in thick silence as everyone awaited more of the story, which seemed so full of mysteries. Richard hesitated for a moment, the weight of what he was about to say clearly visible in his eyes. The silence in the hall intensified, as if the very air was waiting for his words. He looked at Margaret, still lying down, and sighed deeply. "The incident that separated us was more than a fight or disagreement," he began, his voice filled with pain. "It was something that changed everything. Something I couldn't forget, and something she, apparently, spent her life trying to bury." Emily leaned forward slightly, waiting for Richard to continue, but at the same time, dreading what would come next. Margaret's distant expression, which now made so much sense, was the reflection of a secret she had carried for decades, a secret that had somehow shaped her entire life. "It was in our last year of college," Richard said, his words slow and measured. "Margaret and I were inseparable, but that year something happened. A tragedy that involved us in a way that we could never undo." He paused again, as if the memories were too painful to relive. Emily felt the tension rise. She wanted to ask, wanted to demand answers, but she knew Richard would reveal them in his own time. The silence between the two seemed to stretch out until Richard finally broke the barrier. "We were involved in something that got out of our control. An accident, someone was seriously hurt, and Margaret never forgave herself for what happened. The words came out with difficulty, but their impact was like a wave that swept through the hall. The murmurs among the guests began again, but for Emily, all she could hear was the sound of the words, "never forgave herself." The revelation hit Emily hard. Everything was beginning to make sense. The emotional distance of her mother, the way she seemed to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. The incident Richard had mentioned was more than just a simple mistake. It was a tragedy that had shaped Margaret's life. Emily looked at her mother with new eyes, realizing now that the woman she had always known had been tormented by something she had never known about. "The worst part," Richard continued, "was that I also felt responsible. And instead of dealing with it together, we drifted apart. We blamed each other, and that guilt destroyed us. We never spoke about it again." The hall was filled with unbearable tension. Richard continued, "Your mother spent her life trying to make up for that mistake. She distanced herself from everything that reminded her of that time. From me, from the friendship we had. But the weight of it never left her. I saw her suffer, even from afar." His words carried deep sadness, a lost connection that was never repaired. Emily felt the pain of that story reverberating inside her. Her mother, that strong and resolute figure, had been broken by something from the past. A secret buried so deep that now, on the day that was supposed to be one of pure happiness, it had finally emerged. Margaret was awake but still fragile, and Emily could see the weight of the revelation on her face. The decades of silence, of solitary suffering, were there, written in every line of expression that she bore. As Richard continued to speak, Emily's mind began to connect the dots in an unsettling way. Each sentence he spoke added a new layer of meaning, revealing not only her mother's past but also something about Emily's own life. "There was a period when Margaret simply disappeared," Richard said, his voice heavy with the weight of memories. "She distanced herself from everyone, including me, and I never knew where or why she had gone. When we briefly reconnected years later, she was already a different person, carrying a responsibility greater than she could have ever imagined." That sentence hung in the air, and suddenly Emily found herself questioning things that had never crossed her mind before. During her childhood, her mother had always been reserved about the past, as if there was a line Emily was never meant to cross. Now, hearing Richard talk about a distance, about a disappearance, she began to wonder if there was something about her own origins that had also been hidden. The truth was beginning to emerge, subtle and disturbing. "She came back different," Richard continued, looking at Margaret with a mix of longing and understanding. "When I found out she was pregnant, it was as if everything had changed. Whatever had happened during that time we were apart had transformed her in ways I never fully understood." Emily felt a chill down her spine. Was he talking about her? Her mind spun with questions. She had always known that her mother had raised her alone, but there had never been any mention of what had really happened before her birth. Emily blinked, confused. Pregnant? The timeline Richard described didn't match what her mother had always told her. Margaret had gone through all of this alone, always insisting there was no one else in the story. The discomfort in Emily grew as the suspicion that her own story was intertwined with that dark secret. She had always believed she knew her origins, but now everything seemed about to fall apart. The tension increased as the guests around remained stunned, their eyes shifting between Emily, Margaret, and Richard. Emily could barely breathe. The idea that her birth was somehow connected to that tragic incident between her mother and Richard left her bewildered. Richard looked at Emily with an expression of compassion, as if he understood the whirlwind of emotions she was going through. "I didn't know many things, Emily," he said gently. "But when I found out about you, I realized that the past Margaret had buried was about to resurface in a way that even she couldn't avoid. The choices we made back then stayed with us forever." These words resonated deeply in Emily. The choices from her mother's past were intertwined with her own existence in a way she had never suspected. The tragedy, the secret, everything that Richard and Margaret had tried to leave behind now reflected in her own life. The young woman, still stunned by the revelations, began to realize that her story, the wedding that was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, was just one piece in a much larger, older puzzle. Margaret, still pale and fragile, began to move slowly, as if awakening from a deep, unsettling dream. Her chest rose and fell hesitantly, but gradually signs of life became more evident. Her eyes slowly opened, adjusting to the soft light filling the hall, and amidst the silence that hung in the air, she whispered a name, weak but full of contained emotion: Richard. That single name carried decades of untold history, of pain and longing, and her trembling voice brought forth a truth that Emily was not prepared to face. Emily stood completely still, watching the scene with her heart racing. Her mother's whisper of Richard's name echoed in her mind. She looked at him, still kneeling beside Margaret, and felt a mixture of emotions, anger, sadness, but above all, immense bewilderment. How could this man, who until minutes ago was just an unknown waiter, be so deeply connected to her mother's life? And why had Margaret never spoken of him before? The questions whirled endlessly in her head. Richard slowly leaned forward, holding Margaret's hand with even more care, as if she might break at any moment. The look he gave her was full of silent affection, mixed with regret and compassion. "I'm here," he murmured, his voice hoarse and heavy with emotion. The reunion between the two was imbued with an emotional weight greater than anyone there could comprehend. It was as if, after years of silence and distance, the connection between them was still alive, though worn by time. Margaret opened her eyes and fixed her gaze on Richard, her lips trembling slightly. "I should never have left," she murmured, her voice broken by exhaustion and the weight of memories. Her words were a late apology, a confession of what she knew she had lost. Richard shook his head as if to brush off the guilt, but the pain in his eyes showed that he, too, had carried this burden for a long time. This was a conversation that should have happened decades ago. Emily watched in astonishment, feeling as if she were witnessing a scene from a life that wasn't hers but somehow involved her completely. Everything she knew about her mother, everything she thought to be true, was crumbling before her eyes. What else had her mother hidden? What other secrets were there? The young woman felt lost, forced to confront a story she had never imagined existed and that now seemed to redefine everything. Little by little, Margaret seemed to regain some of her strength. She gently squeezed Richard's hand, her eyes filled with tears but also with a strange acceptance. "I tried to move on, I tried to bury all of this, but I never could." Her voice was choked, and Emily felt the weight of deep regret in those words. There was something there, something her mother had never been able to overcome, and now, at the most unlikely moment, everything was coming to the surface. Richard, still holding her hand, sighed deeply, as if finally releasing a burden he had carried for many years. "I could never move on either," he admitted, his voice low. "I always wondered what could have been, what we could have done differently." His words floated in the air, full of a sense of loss, but also of a chance for redemption. Their reunion, though laden with sorrow, carried a strange feeling of hope. Emily, trying to process everything, began to realize that her mother's story was not just about the past, it was about her too. The secret Margaret had carried for so long was now overflowing, and Emily saw, with painful clarity, that her own life was deeply intertwined with those decisions and secrets. It was impossible not to feel a mix of hurt and compassion as she saw her mother like this, vulnerable, finally confronting the truth she had avoided for so many years. As Margaret and Richard exchanged words filled with emotion, Emily felt as though she were standing on the edge of a precipice, where she would have to make a choice. She could walk away, refuse to understand what was happening, or she could allow herself to look closer, confront the truths her mother had hidden from her. The past was there, pulsating before her eyes, and she knew that no matter how she felt, this story wouldn't end without her also finding her own truth within it. Margaret looked at Richard with eyes full of sorrow and regret, but also with something new, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel for many years: hope. Their reunion was not just a reckoning with the past but an opening for something they had never had the chance to live. "I never forgot you," Margaret whispered, her voice faltering. "I always wondered what it would have been like if things had been different." Richard, his face marked by time and pain, held her hand with a gentle firmness, as if he didn't want to let her go again. "I thought about it every day too. But we were both consumed by our own guilt and hurt. We spent our lives trying to erase what happened, when maybe what we needed was to forgive each other." His words lingered in the air, filled with meaning. It was a second chance, an opportunity that fate seemed to have saved for this moment. The years they had spent apart, each following their own path without ever reconnecting, now seemed heavy and unnecessary. Margaret, feeling the warmth of Richard's hand, realized that despite everything, the feeling that had united them so long ago was still there, buried but intact. She smiled, shyly, as if seeing him for the first time. "I thought I'd never have the chance to tell you how sorry I am for running away." "I ran away too, Margaret," Richard admitted. "I hid in silence, let fear take over me. But we're here now. And maybe, finally, we can fix what we broke." His voice was full of a vulnerability they had never shared decades before. This reunion wasn't just about two old friends, it was the rebirth of a love that had been interrupted, something that had never had the chance to fully blossom. The hall, which moments ago had been engulfed in chaos and grief, now seemed to be wrapped in an aura of expectation. The guests watched, many without understanding the depth of the story unfolding before them, but all sensing the importance of the moment. The soft lights and white flowers around them now seemed like silent witnesses to a reconciliation that was much more than a conversation between two old acquaintances. Margaret, her eyes still brimming with tears, finally felt the weight of regret begin to dissolve. "I was selfish, Richard, but the truth is I was always afraid to face you. To face what we left behind. I didn't think you'd still be here." Richard gently shook his head. "I was always here. Maybe not physically, but I never truly left." The depth of his words echoed within her, and she realized that she was finally ready to let him back into her life. With their hands intertwined, they didn't need to say much more. It was as if all the years of silence, all the secrets, were being replaced by a new understanding, by a love that had withstood time, even if its form had changed. The second chance they had both avoided for so long was now in front of them, and they both knew they couldn't waste it. Emily, watching from afar, saw the glow in her mother's eyes and realized that something deeply important was happening. This was not just a meeting between two people from the past, but the possibility of healing, for both of them. Her mother and Richard had, in a way, been prevented from fully living their lives because of one mistake, one wrong choice. But now, at that moment, in front of everyone, they were giving themselves a chance for a new beginning. The years of separation, the old wounds, all of it seemed to begin healing right there in that hall. Margaret, with her hand firmly in Richard's, smiled in a way that Emily had never seen before. There was a lightness, a relief, something that didn't come from youth, but from accepting who she really was, and what could have been. And now, finally, from what still could be. Emily's wedding, which had been engulfed in a whirlwind of tragedy, now seemed to have transformed. The hall, still lit by soft lights and surrounded by white flowers, seemed to breathe again, but with a different energy. The disaster everyone had feared hadn't destroyed the event, but redefined it. The wedding, which had begun with a promise of love between Emily and her fiancé, had now become something greater, the stage for a much deeper and unexpected reunion between two souls who had been lost to time. Emily, watching her mother speaking with Richard, felt a wave of emotions. The man who had saved her mother, who had carried with him buried secrets, was now part of her own story in a way she could never have imagined. It was as if the universe had charted mysterious paths to bring them all to that moment. The love that seemed lost in the past between Margaret and Richard was now resurfacing, bringing with it a sense of renewal and healing. She looked at her fiancé, who was watching her with a gentle smile. The two exchanged glances without needing to say a word. He squeezed her hand firmly, offering the kind of quiet support Emily so desperately needed. The young bride now understood that this wedding wouldn't be remembered just as the union of the two of them, but as the day when hidden truths came to light, transforming the meaning of the celebration. The pain and secrets of the past had finally been exposed, but with them came forgiveness. As Margaret and Richard continued to speak, their voices soft and intimate, Emily felt something change inside her. The initial hurt at not knowing this part of her mother's life was slowly giving way to understanding. The weight Margaret had carried for so long, the secrets and decisions she had made, all began to make sense. Emily now saw her mother not just as the strong, quiet figure she had always known, but as a woman who, despite trying to hide the past, had suffered deeply because of it. The party, which had seemed ruined by despair and tragedy, was slowly coming back to life. The guests, still shocked by the events, also seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Some began to resume low conversations, whispering among themselves about what they had just witnessed. The atmosphere, once filled with silent panic, was now permeated by a different energy, the hope of a new beginning. Margaret and Richard stood side by side, the years of separation and the secrets that had kept them apart slowly fading. Their gaze, full of mutual understanding, brought visible relief to both of them. They didn't need to say everything at that moment, but they knew that finally, they could have a chance to rebuild something, to reclaim what time had stolen from them. Emily realized that this moment, that instant between her mother and Richard, represented the healing of wounds that had seemed impossible to close. In the background, the soft sound of music began to fill the hall again. The pianist, sensing that the mood had changed, began to play once more, but gently, as if respecting the solemnity of the moment. The music flowed through the air, cradling the shy smiles that began to appear on the faces of the guests. The twinkling lights seemed to dance in harmony with the reconciliation unfolding before them. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, taking it all in. She knew that this day, although it had begun with promises of love for her and her fiancé, now meant much more. Her wedding had become the catalyst for a reconnection her mother had never believed was possible. And as Emily felt the warmth of her fiancé's hand on hers, she knew that, just like Margaret and Richard, her own journey with him would be marked by challenges, but also by the ability to love, to forgive and to move forward. What could have been a disaster was, in fact, the beginning of something new. Emily's wedding would be remembered by everyone not for the panic, but for the union of long-buried truths, the strength of forgiveness, and the celebration of love in its many forms. Margaret and Richard, in front of everyone, were the symbol that even after years of silence and pain, true love can find its way back. If you enjoyed the incredible story of Emily, Margaret, and Richard, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of the upcoming videos. If you love emotional chronicles and want to support our channel so we can continue bringing more quality content, consider contributing through Buy Me a Coffee. The link is in the first pinned comment. Your help is essential for us to continue improving. Thank you for your support. See you in the next emotional chronicle.